The first thing I want to do is check who the authors of the paper are. I want to check their level of expertise and the field of science which they bring to their interpretation. I have to be sure that what I read has been very carefully considered. The first researcher is Mark L. Muir, and I can see that this individual is a horse rider, not just a researcher, and they're from Slovenia, and they are in the Institute of Kinesiology Research, and I can see there's some strength and conditioning science, and that this person is based in a university, and their current position is associate professor. And skills and expertise: biofeedback, electromyography, inertial measurement units, MATLAB, and signal analysis. They have 8 publications, which is fairly impressive. So not just one publication. I'll just scroll down so that you can see their previous research. And this is the second researcher, who is the professor, and they have 348 publications, and again, same university, and skills and expertise. This is an impressive biog here, an impressive set of skills and expertise. Posture, sports injuries, exercise science, sports biomechanics, strength and conditioning, rehabilitation, biomechanics, muscle function, and exercise performance. So there doesn't seem to be very much that this researcher would not know about the topic. Looking at additional affiliations, I can see that they are a peer reviewer for some 8 journals, and that for the past 14 years they have been based in the Department of Mathematics, and their research field is exercise therapy, motor control, basics of strength training and conditioning, neuromuscular functions of the trunk and spinal health. And also for the same period of time, an external research collaborator and managing director, head of research, and from the year 2000 to 2005 their field of study was kinesiology, and before that from 1997 to 2002 physiotherapy, and 1996 to 2000 we have strength and conditioning. So I really feel like we're in good hands here, and that they have a substantial level of academic underpinning for the paper that they've written. So now I can be confident that as I read through this paper, it has a very good pedigree. This is a 2021 paper, so it's relatively current. This paper is looking at how novice and advanced riders compare with each other in terms of how they attenuate the forces from the horse and the muscular activity involved. So the abstract immediately states that low back pain is the issue here, and that it lowers performance, distracts from the development of the athlete. And a lower incidence of low back pain has been observed in the professional riding population, despite their higher training volumes. So that even though professional riders ride more than novice riders, their pain levels appear to be lower. So the paper aims to describe the neuromuscular mechanisms of advanced and novice riders and how they attenuate the shockwave generated between the horse and themselves. Now, they only have 6 novice riders here, 9 advanced riders, and the novice riders tended to be younger than the advanced riders, and they've used only 4 horses aged approximately 15 plus or minus 3 years. And they recorded the EMG activity of the rider's trunk or upper body muscles and inertial data from the horse's leg, saddle and vertebrae of the riders at walk, trot and canter. So they've used two modalities here to measure acceleration of the body and the associated muscle activity or muscle activation. And they found that the advanced group had a superior shock attenuating ability and a higher overall muscle tone, and that the groups differed mostly in timing of the muscle activation rather than the intensity of muscle activation. And what that means is that the advanced riders use a strategy of feed-forward anticipation for attenuating shock compared with the novice riders. So in other words, they were just a bit more mindful of the forces and how they were going to strategize to attenuate them. And the researchers say that this finding is of great interest for equestrian athletes and coaches because it points to a greater importance of training muscular anticipation within the trunk stabilizers rather than overall muscle activation. So in other words, riders should not just be training their core, they need to be training control of their core. The point of the introduction is to introduce you to the topic in terms of what research has gone before it. So low back pain alters the coordination dynamics of the horse and rider. Yes, when your back is sore, it could be stiff, for example, or you could be compensating so as not to cause more pain. So we can expect the body not to move normally when there is low back pain present. It's the most common chronic injury experienced by equestrian athletes, and we do have a lot of evidence for that, including from my own research, and that this is linked to poor postural control. So not just posture, as in core activation, but control of it. Lack of balance, stability and alignment of the skeleton at the pelvic level. So they're quite concerned here about the pelvis and its connection with the low back, how it's aligned and how stable it is. So again, higher incidence of back pain in amateur riders when compared to advanced, but conversely, high volumes and repetitive motions have previously been correlated to high prevalence rates of low back pain in the athletic population. So what this means is that where other researchers have attributed low back pain to a high repetitive workload, other athletes don't have the force of a horse directed at them. And the authors here explain this contradiction by the more harmonic riding technique of the advanced riders, and that their level of expertise is a very important factor in influencing the prevalence of low back pain in horse riding, so that it is skill dependent. And understanding the biomechanical differences between advanced and novice equestrians is therefore of major interest. So again, they're setting us up to talk about how the rider manages the forces of the horse being directed towards them. So in the last decade, previous comparable studies have looked at joint angles and inertial data, and it's known that the horse rider's pelvis acts as a communicational channel, physically interacting with the horse's behaviour. Almost 20 years ago, it was demonstrated that advanced riders achieved a higher level of synchronicity and coordination compared to novice riders. Harmony, also known as coordination dynamics, is strongly related to the postural control of the rider. So this is not just about posture, it's more about how the rider controls their posture. And this is dependent on the coordination and neuromuscular awareness of the core muscles. So riders very much need to be tuned into their core muscles. And in my experience, I have found that they may well have a strong core, but it's challenging for them to be able to recruit those core muscles voluntarily while riding. Publications analysing biological differences between advanced and novice riders are sparse. Oh yes, they are. And they rarely consider mechanics and biology simultaneously. Yes, so again, this is about control of the posture, not just the alignment, but control of it. So they've stated their aim here and how they're going to describe how the rider's neuromuscular system copes with external mechanical strain when they are exposed to postural perturbations elicited by the horse in motion. They're going to use inertial and surface EMG measures to portray the skill-dependent differences of the interactions between the horse and rider and between the two groups, novice and advanced. They hypothesized that advanced riders would show a greater ability to attenuate the shockwave generated by the horse's movement by having a higher overall muscle activity level and earlier timing of it. So they took 6 novice riders who trained between 2 and 4 hours a week, who had on average 10 plus or minus 8 years of experience, and 9 advanced riders, older, who trained 35 hours a week, that's quite a climb, and who had 17 plus or minus 9 years of experience. Well, you would think that 8 years of experience, could they be considered novices? And these were recruited from the Spanish Classical School of Riding. So this is a high level of riding. They used 4 horses, average age 15, and they were very similar in that they showed self-carriage capacities and a calm and steady gait. And they chose these from a pool of 200 horses. So they've been very careful in their selection of a horse so that they could control the variable of the horse's movement. They performed 60 horse strides at walk, trot and canter in a random balanced order, and the trot was rising and collected canter was always on the right rein. They used only one saddle, an all-purpose 18-inch for all trials, but it was fitted in horizontal balance. And the riders were directed to match their knee with the knee roll of the saddle to elicit a 90-degree angle of the knee joint. Interesting. So they wouldn't necessarily be riding in their usual stirrup length, so that could have affected the outcome. And novice riders tend to have a preferred stirrup length, and obviously they would take them up for jumping, but there is almost just one stirrup length where they feel that they have the most mechanical advantage, or that they feel stable, or that they feel safe. So I would suggest that you would reflect on that. How do you feel when your stirrup length is changed or altered? They recorded EMG activity or electrical signals from erector spinae, the back of the rider, multifidus, which is in the same region, the abdominal external oblique, so more laterally of the rider's upper body, biceps femoris, which is behind the thigh, one of the hamstrings, vastus lateralis, which is one of the thigh muscles laterally on the thigh, and gastrocnemius lateralis, which is one of the muscles at the back of the lower leg. And they've done this on both sides of the rider's body. For the inertial measures, they place them at the level of the fourth thoracic vertebrae. So here, T4, at the level of the first lumbar, here, on the rider's helmet, here, and on the cantle of the saddle, and on the horse's right forelimb. So they're looking at the acceleration of the rider in relation to the acceleration of the horse. So they averaged the strides to obtain a representative cycle for each rider at each gait, because obviously 60 strides, they're not all going to be exactly the same, so they aggregated them across both the subjects and the gaits. Shock attenuation was calculated between accelerations at T4 to L1, here, A and B, between the head and the saddle, 1 and 4, between T4 and the saddle, A and 4, and L1 and the saddle, here and here. A correlation coefficient is defined as a number between -1 and 1 that tells you the strength and direction of a relationship, a linear relationship, between variables. In other words, it reflects how similar the measurements of two or more variables are across a data set. As one variable changes, the other variables change in the same direction. A positive correlation indicates that the two move in the same direction, with a value of 1 denoting a perfect positive correlation and a value of -1 showing a perfect negative or inverse correlation, and 0 means no linear correlation exists. For this paper, they wanted to determine the relationship between mechanical strain and neuromuscular response. So shock attenuation and muscle activity. They used a statistical test to identify significant differences between both peak coefficients and the time lag at which they occurred. So that was quite clever. They didn't just show the degree of shock attenuation, they showed how the rider's body strategized that attenuation in terms of timing of muscle activation. And the results showed that the T4L1, let's go to that again, so the rider's ribcage region, and the T4 to the saddle, ribcage lumbar, appeared to be lower, i.e. more efficient in the advanced group, but due to the lack of interaction between groups in the remaining shock attenuation waves, they only conducted further analysis on T4L1 and T4 and the saddle. They considered T4 and saddle shock attenuation, but not between the muscle activity signals generated at T4 and L1. This data set is aiming to demonstrate that it's the thoracic and lumbar spine which is attenuating the shock, and not just the thoracic. And then they provided a diagram to show the overall shock attenuation for each group at each gait. The strength of the shock attenuation is represented by the negative values, and the positive values are the lack of attenuation. So we have the novice results here, and then the advanced results here. So we can see from this chart that muscle activation which are these box plots in walk, trot and canter for erector spinae and multifidus, then the helmet with the saddle and the erector spinae with the saddle and multifidus with the saddle. For novice and advanced riders, show that in the walk there isn't a great deal of attenuation happening at the level of the saddle, and that erector spinae is activated by the advanced group but not the novice group. And the yellow, which is the helmet, and the saddle, they are about the same. And in trot, again, because they were rising, almost no attenuation. And in the canter, the greatest difference here amongst all of this data would seem to be the muscle activation data for the helmet and saddle. So that we can see that the novice group appeared to be attenuating shock with the head, but the advanced group did not do so to the same extent. And this might have something to do with how they strategize their muscle activity. This could be a technique which contributes to their skill. So for the EMG activity, the advanced riders showed a statistically significant higher overall EMG amplitude compared to novice riders. And the cross correlations between EMG and shock attenuation showed that in all cases, as the EMG signal increased, the shock attenuation waves decreased. And that the correlation overall was very strong because it was set at 0.8. But what we've also got to be guarded about in these types of diagrams and the outcomes or the results is that unless we have something to compare the shock attenuation readings with, we don't know whether -15 is a big number or a very small one in terms of the differences between what the novices are doing and what the advanced riders are doing. It may be very, very small or a small amount of muscle activation. In other words, we can't really tell much about the amplitude of the advanced riders' movement because the differences are quite small. But nevertheless, there were differences. They were found to be statistically significant. They had 6 novices and 9 advanced, although you could argue that the 9 advanced were very advanced. So how novice were the novice riders? But nevertheless, they have identified a difference between the two groups, a clear difference. And in all cases, as the EMG signal increased, the shock attenuation waves decreased. So what that means is that the more muscle activation, the more the shock attenuation. So in other words, the more positive postural control that a rider has over their trunk muscles, the more they can attenuate, absorb, or mitigate the shock of the forces being directed towards their upper bodies. Here are the two groups, advanced and novice. They are walking, trotting and cantering. And the dotted line represents the high correlation threshold. So what can we see here from the EMG, the muscle activation data, and the two data sets that they collected? In terms of muscle activation, we can see from the cross-correlation coefficients generated, and these are the regions where they collected the muscle activation data, because they cross that line, there is a strong correlation in walk and canter, not so much for trot, because we determined that there was less shock in trot because they were rising. What we see here is that for canter, the pink lines, muscle activation occurred across these two data sets. And interestingly, this corresponds with another study which advocates that learning to ride a horse is much easier in canter. And typically riders learn to balance in trot before they canter, but the paradox is they may find the trot easier to balance to when they have learned to balance in canter, i.e. with postural control based on muscle activation. And this chart shows that for walk, trot and canter, for each of the muscle activations, that there was a time lag difference between shock attenuation and muscle activation. And where you see these stars, that this was significantly different between the groups. So of the advanced group, there is a lower time lag, and these readings correspond to the opposite. So no time lag or a negative time lag. So we can clearly see that for many of the muscle activations, that the advanced group were somehow anticipating shock and preparing for it by activating the relevant muscles. So now we move on to the discussion phase of this paper. So they restate their aims, that they investigated shock attenuation behaviour at the back of horse riders at walk, posting trot or rising trot and canter. And the relevance of neuromuscular activity of the rider's trunk muscles and its interaction with such attenuation has also been analysed. They compared the two groups so that they could understand how proficiency level affects the biomechanics of horse riding. I would state postural proficiency level. They hypothesized that advanced riders would show better shock attenuation capacities by activating their muscles earlier and to a higher degree. The hypothesis was generally met, with some exceptions. Advanced riders do have a greater ability to absorb shock waves, but this is more strongly related to the timing of muscle activation rather than the level of activation. And overall, the results suggest that both groups are actively using their muscles to attenuate the shock produced by the horse in motion. But muscle activity levels are not as high as seen in other athletic activities, such as cycling or running. Nor did the trials elicit substantial neuromuscular fatigue. And these findings are consistent with the moderate riders' EMG activity reported by previous authors. So what they're doing here is referring back to other studies to explain their findings. Shock attenuation at the levels of T5 to L4 and T5 and the saddle are more efficient, i.e. lower in advanced riders than novice riders. I think what they mean is T4, and that this was associated with EMG signals revealing minimal differences between the groups in terms of peak correlation. As I said earlier, what does the data mean in terms of the amplitude? How much muscle activation is required to attenuate shock? This can't be interpreted from the data, but that's not what they measured. But substantial and consistent differences in time lag. So this is the important thing here, that postural control is required for shock attenuation. And, as they've stated at the beginning, to mitigate the risk of low back pain. This study demonstrates that the most relevant difference between novice and advanced riders regarding the relationship between EMG muscle activity and shock attenuation lies in the timing and not the level of correlation. Advanced riders were able to attenuate shock waves by activating their muscles earlier than novice riders. So we keep coming back to timing being emphasized here, and that timing or anticipation plays a major role in the management of impact forces. Another researcher, nearly 25 years ago, demonstrated that eccentric contractions, i.e. muscle tension increasing as muscles lengthen, during running impair the ability to dissipate shock propagation. Hence, pre-activation or anticipation is crucial to avoid eccentric contractions. Several publications have shown that modifying saddle characteristics and fit can effectively reduce spinal loading of the rider. Yes. Yet this paper demonstrates that not only saddle configuration, but physical fitness and level of expertise, postural expertise, can considerably reduce shock propagation through the spine. So that's a very useful finding. And then they talk about their limitations, where they've used horses, over which they have a limited control, but they did do their best to control for homogeneity or similarities between the horses' gaits. And repeatability of measurements will inevitably be limited. The small sample group, which is always a big issue in interpreting data reliably, is not representative of the highly scattered riding population, and indeed it was difficult to determine what they considered novice and advanced. Can we assume that the novices were dressage riders? And they acknowledged that the use of different horses might have affected the results. Well, that's always the case. And again, they reiterate that they chose the 4 most consistent and similar horses over a sample of 200 highly trained horses in order to keep variability to a minimum while preserving animal welfare. So one horse could not be ridden by every rider. To summarise this paper, it was produced by 2 highly qualified researchers whose interpretation of the results was based on a wide range of expertise underpinning the study. They examined the relationship between shock attenuation and muscle activity across novice and advanced riders, and highlighted that this may relate to low back pain in this population, although their subjects were pain-free. They used only one saddle, but this was fitted in horizontal balance, and they selected horses with comparable movement to control for their variability. All riders had knees positioned in 90 degrees of flexion, which may have created instability for some of them, impacting on the data collected. They selected only the results for the vertebral region activity and applied a very strong correlation coefficient of 0.8 to explain their findings. They found that advanced riders anticipate forces directed at them from the horse, and that, in contrast with novice riders, they activated their core in anticipation of it, potentially manipulating stability of their head to influence core muscle activation. This demonstrated that timing of muscle activation was more important than intensity as a strategy to attenuate the forces of shock and, in turn, development of low back pain. This reflected the importance of postural control in the management of equitation forces, and they acknowledge that this is an equitation skill. Although postural control is somewhat different for those who are in pain. So at what point do we train for postural control? And should the rider be pain-free to do the exercises? I would argue yes, but that the postural control exercises should not cause the rider pain. These results demonstrate that timing of muscle activation was more important than intensity as a strategy to attenuate the forces of shock. Results reflected the importance of postural control in the management of equitation forces, and the researchers acknowledge that this is an equitation skill, so that when we refer to skilled riders, we can consider their postural skill as important as technical skill. But we must remember that this study hinted at the postural skill required to mitigate low back pain, and that it pointed to anticipating shock with activation of the rider's back muscles. So plenty to get you thinking there about how we can improve equitation skill and potentially to help reduce risk of low back pain.